Well, my job in writing Elizabeth the Queen was not only to explain what she does, but to tell what she's really like, and to take the reader as close as possible to Elizabeth the human being, the wife, the mother, and the friend, as well as the highly respected leader. Today I'm going to talk first about what it was like to write about Queen Elizabeth. And second, I'd like to share with you some of the many surprising discoveries that I made about the Queen. Because she is the best-known woman in the world, people feel as if they know her, but the real woman is very different from the woman in velvet and ermine. Several years ago, when the Queen was at one of her yearly garden parties at Buckingham Palace, making her way through a crowd of nearly 9,000 people and greeting a selection of guests, she was asking such standard questions as, "Have you come far?" When one woman looked at her and said, "What do you do?" Several days later, at a friend's birthday party, the Queen described the exchange and confessed, "I had no idea what to say." It was the first time in all the years of meeting people that anybody had ever asked her that question. Well, my job in writing Elizabeth the Queen was not only to explain what she does, but to tell what she's really like, and to take the reader as close as possible to Elizabeth the human being, the wife, the mother, and the friend, as well as the highly respected leader. Today I'm going to talk first about what it was like to write about Queen Elizabeth. And second, I'd like to share with you some of the many surprising discoveries that I made about the Queen. Because she is the best-known woman in the world, people feel as if they know her, but the real woman is very different from the woman in velvet and ermine. This is my 6th biography, all of them about larger-than-life characters that Barbara mentioned, but there is no one like the Queen, and she lives in her very own remarkable world. While other heads of state have come and gone, Elizabeth is the longest-serving leader in the world, spanning the 20th and 21st centuries. She is the 40th monarch in the 1,000-year history of the British monarchy, reigning over the United Kingdom of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, along with 15 realms and 14 overseas territories. She is the second monarch to celebrate a Diamond Jubilee, marking 60 years on the throne, which is a milestone that she will reach on February 6th. The only other was her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, whose celebration was 115 years ago, in 1897, when she was 78 years old. If Elizabeth, who will soon turn 86, is still on the throne in September 2015, she will surpass Victoria's reign of nearly 64 years. Between the two of them, Victoria and Elizabeth have been on the throne for 124 of the last 174 years and have symbolized Britain far longer than the 4 men who were kings between their reigns. Elizabeth is always surrounded by people, but being queen makes her a solitary and singular figure. It is crucial for her to keep a delicate balance at all times. If she seems too mysterious and distant, she loses her bond with her subjects. But if she seems too much like everyone else, she loses her mystique. She doesn't carry a passport. She doesn't have a driver's license, although one of her cousins told me that she drives like a bat out of hell on the roads of her country estates. She can't vote. She can't appear as a witness in court, and she can't change her faith from Anglican to Roman Catholic. And because of her hereditary position, everyone around her, including her closest friends and her family, bows and curtsies when they greet her and when they say goodbye to her. Although she was trained by strict nannies who prevented her from being spoiled, she was also trained from childhood to expect this deference. A friend of mine told me about the time when then Princess Elizabeth came to visit his family castle in Scotland, and he playfully threw her onto a sofa. His father, the 12th Earl of Airlie, took him by the arm, punched him in the stomach, and said, "Don't you ever do that to royalty." The princess didn't mind, my friend told me, but that was the structure in which she was brought up. So how does a biographer, particularly an American, penetrate the royal bubble, especially when the Queen has had a policy for the past 60 years of not granting interviews? Actually, it really wasn't too different from the way I've approached my other books, which was to turn to those who knew her best for insights and information. I am a longtime Anglophile, and I've visited Britain frequently over the past 3 decades and have made a lot of friends, some of whom helped me when I was reporting my book on Princess Diana in the late 1990s. When I started researching the Queen's life, I went back to a group of key sources who agreed to help me again and to introduce me to more people who knew the royal family. They also served as my advocates in getting cooperation from Buckingham Palace. My book on Diana had been fair to the royal family and particularly to Charles, so the senior staff at the palace briefed the Queen and they gave me the green light. As a result, I had access to her inner circle of close friends and advisors. While the Queen has disciplined herself to keep her views and emotions under wraps in public, those close to her shared with me some of her fascinating opinions and feelings, what worried her most about Prince Charles when his marriage to Diana was falling apart, for example. What would happen if she became physically or mentally incapacitated? And even some politically sensitive opinions, including one hot-button issue that she discussed with an American ambassador. Her friends explained the secrets of her serenity and her courage, and they sized her up, sometimes in unusually perceptive ways. Monty Roberts, the California horse whisperer, who is one of her most unlikely friends, told me that when the Queen gave him good advice, she showed an incredible ability to read intention, just like a horse does. With the assistance of the palace, I was also able to watch the Queen and Prince Philip in many different settings, at the Garter Parade at Windsor Castle, while presenting honors at Buckingham Palace, investitures, and at one of her annual garden parties at the palace. For that, I received a personalized invitation on white pasteboard embossed with in gold with the Queen's crown and cipher, announcing that the Lord Chamberlain had been commanded by Her Majesty to invite me. Everybody got that. Watching the Queen at that garden party make her way along a line of people, I was struck by her measured pace. Her Lord Chamberlain, who is the senior official at Buckingham Palace, later told me that she moves slowly to absorb everything that's going on and to take as much in as she can. I also marveled at her mastery of brief but focused conversations and her sturdy stance, a technique that she once explained to the wife of one of her foreign secretaries by lifting her evening gown above her ankle and saying, "One plants one's feet apart like this. Always keep them parallel. Make sure your weight is evenly distributed," and that's all there is to it. As I observed the Queen over the course of a year, I accumulated impressions that help me understand how she carries out her role and how earnestly she does her job, with great discipline and concentration in every situation. She is not just a figurehead, and she has an impressive range of duties. Every day, except Christmas and Easter, she spends several hours reading those government boxes that Barbara just described. They are red leather boxes that can only be opened by 4 keys. She reads them in the morning and at night and even on weekends. One of her close friends told me about the time during one of the Queen's visits when she was desk-bound all morning. "Must you, ma'am?" her friend asked. The Queen replied, "If I missed once, I might never catch up again." Mary Soames, who is the youngest daughter of the Queen's first Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, told me that when Elizabeth was a young 25-year-old queen, her father had been impressed by her attentiveness, that she always paid attention to whatever she was doing. It's hard to imagine the amount of information that the Queen has accumulated over 6 decades, and she has used it in exercising her right to be consulted, to encourage, and to warn when she meets with government officials, as well as senior military officers, clergymen, diplomats, and judges who come to her for confidential private audiences. As she once said, the fact that there's nobody else there gives them a feeling that they can say what they like. The most important of these encounters have been the weekly audiences with her 12 prime ministers. Consider the trajectory. From Churchill, who was born in the 19th century and served in the army of her great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, to David Cameron, her current prime minister, who was born 3 years after her youngest child, Prince Edward. She actually glimpsed for the first time, her future 12th prime minister when he appeared at age 8 in a school production of Toad Hall with Edward. Probably her most fascinating relationship was with Margaret Thatcher, and in the course of my reporting, I gained some great insights into how that relationship worked, and some of which contradicted the common view. The Queen does not have executive power, but she does have unique influence. In her role as head of state, she represents the government officially at home and abroad, but she also serves as head of nation, which means that she connects with people to reward their achievements and remain in touch with their concerns. 2 decades past the normal retirement age, she still does something like 400 engagements a year, traveling around the United Kingdom to cities as well as tiny hamlets. Charles Pole, who served as private secretary to both John Major and Margaret Thatcher, told me that the Queen knows every inch of this country in a way no one else does. She spends so much time meeting people that she has an understanding of what other people's lives are like. She understands what the normal human condition is. She's also spent an extraordinary amount of time honoring citizens and members of the military for exemplary service. In 60 years, she has conferred more than 400,000 honors and awards and given them in person over 600 times. People need pats on the back sometimes, she has said. It's a very dingy world otherwise. Traveling with the Queen was particularly valuable, especially the overseas royal tour I took to Bermuda and Trinidad. She was 83 years old at the time, and her program called for long days of meeting and greeting. Her stamina was impressive, matched only by 88-year-old Prince Philip. Whenever they go off on a trip together like that, the Lord Chamberlain always accompanies to the airport, and Philip turns around and waves at him and says, "Mind the shop." I got a real sense of how much in sync Philip and Elizabeth are, with an expert choreography, sort of like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. I also saw aspects of him that contradict his caricature of brashness and insensitivity. He always watches the Queen intently to see whether she needs any assistance. I once saw him bring a little child over to greet her. He often spots people in the crowd who can't see very well, and he'll walk them out to give them a better vantage point. When the Queen needs a boost, he's also there with a humorous aside such as, "Don't be so sad, sausage." On the last night in Trinidad, I also witnessed at close range what I had heard about from several people, that the Queen doesn't perspire. even in the hottest temperatures. The British High Commissioner was hosting a garden party in his hilltop home on such a steamy evening that everyone, including me, was dripping from the heat. But after an hour of lively conversations with some 65 guests, the Queen walked past me very close by, and there was absolutely no moisture on her face. One of her cousins who traveled in the tropics with her explained to me, in her own inimitable way, that the Queen's skin does not run water, and that while it may look good, it does make her uncomfortable. I saw further evidence of this a year later on a July day at Ground Zero in Manhattan when the temperature hit 103 degrees. And one of the women the Queen spoke to said to me afterwards, "We were all pouring sweat, but she didn't have a bead on her. That must be what it's like to be a royal." During these trips, I was able to see the Buckingham Palace machinery on the road, to get to know the senior officials, and to get a feel for the atmosphere around the Queen and the way her household has changed from the early days when it was run entirely by aristocratic men. As I stood in the lobby of her hotel in Trinidad, her master of the household pointed toward a half-dozen footmen, one of whom was a woman, all dressed in navy blue suits. "See Sam over there," he said. "He has a master's degree in paleontology." It was a far cry from the stereotype of Downton Abbey. Getting to know all the places important to the Queen further deepened my understanding. At her stables in Berkshire, one of her horse trainers took me out on the gallops, which are the rolling hills where she loves to spend hours in the early morning mist, wearing her headscarf, her tweed jacket, and her Wellington boots as she watches her racehorses work out. At Holyrood House, her castle in Edinburgh, a former senior palace official gave me a private tour. I spent the night in the tower of the Castle of May, which is the Queen Mother's house in northern Scotland, where the Queen used to visit every year. I hiked the hills and walked along the River Dee at the Queen's estate in the Scottish Highland, Balmoral. At Sandringham, her estate in Norfolk, where she retreats for nearly 6 weeks every winter, I spent a day getting a tour of the stud farm with her stud manager and her head stallion groom. I also spent a day inspecting the royal yacht Britannia, which is now a museum near Edinburgh. And I was lucky enough to attend several dinners in the ballroom and the picture gallery at Buckingham Palace. I was not, alas, a guest of the Queen, but I was invited by Prince Charles, who was hosting his annual gatherings of his Prince of Wales Foundation. But sitting at a table decorated with George III's silver gilt candelabra and sculpted centerpieces, I could immerse myself in the experience of being served by footmen in royal livery in rooms where the Queen entertains heads of state. But my favorite moments were at Windsor, which the Queen considers her real home. I spent time with 2 of the Queen's elderly first cousins, who have known her longer than anybody else. Both live near the castle in modest homes that the Queen gave to them. And every Sunday after church, the Queen drives her Jaguar to visit one of the cousins, Margaret Rhodes, who greets her with a curtsy and hands her a gin and Dubonnet. And they sit down and they chat about friends and family. As I sat on Margaret's sagging sofa in her living room, where her dog's toys were scattered all around on the floor, I could imagine the Queen sitting in the very same spot with her hat on her head, but completely relaxed. At public events, I watched the Queen at a distance, always the smiling icon moving through the crowd, careful not to engage too much. So it was especially helpful to have 3 social encounters at private gatherings. And each time I caught the animated gestures, the sparkling blue eyes, and the flashing smile familiar to her friends, but rare in public. On my first meeting, during a garden party at the British ambassador's residence here in Washington, I watched the Queen have a spirited conversation with my husband about the Kentucky Derby, and I remembered what the British artist Howard Morgan had told me after painting her portrait. "Her private side took me completely by surprise," he said. "She talks like an Italian. She waves her hands about." 2 years later, after I'd been working on the Queen's biography for a year, I met her again at a reception at St. James's Palace, this time in honor of the Pilgrims, which is a group that promotes Anglo-American fellowship. When I mentioned to her that my daughter was getting married in London, she asked, "When is the wedding?" "The 4th of July," I replied. "Oh," she said, "that's a little dangerous." Once again, I saw the smile and the twinkle. The third time was a month before the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton. Again, we met at St. James's Palace at a party given by one of the Queen's cousins. I knew that the Queen would be there, but I didn't expect her to stay 90 minutes, and she was in high spirits. The atmosphere was much more informal than the Pilgrims' reception, probably because so many of her friends and family members were there. And she was making her way happily on her own without any attendants running interference for her. And what really struck me was that here she was in her own palace, but she was merely another guest, which was a measure to me of her surprising humility. When I greeted her, I told her that I'd recently been to the home of one of her American friends in Florida. "I've never been to that house," she said. So I told her about it, and particularly that how much of it had been designed for their grandchildren. "Yes," she said, "and they have so many, don't they?" Clearly, she didn't miss a trick. The first question that people ask me about the Queen is what was most surprising? What was the most surprising thing I learned about her, which is very difficult to answer because so much was unexpected. One surprise was that humility that I just mentioned, part of her side that is seldom seen. Behind her regal and dignified image, the Queen is also smart, shrewd, tolerant, cozy, sensitive, lively, funny, compassionate, spontaneous, keenly observant, and even earthy. So I'll give you a few of the many examples of these traits that I found. How about cozy? When the American artist Frolic Weymouth was at Windsor Castle to paint a portrait of Prince Philip, the Queen invited him to lunch in her private dining room. To Weymouth's amazement, there were no butlers around to serve the meal. Not only did the Queen insist on serving him from a buffet, she also insisted on clearing the table. "She stacked the plates," he said, which is what we were taught never to do when we were growing up. Another time, she was entertaining a larger group at a luncheon, and she told the man next to her, "I need to explain about the napkins," as she looked down the table. She said, "They're doing it all wrong. They have the starched side down so the napkins will slide off their knees. Do it like this with the unstarched side on your lap, and then you tuck it under your bottom." What about spontaneous? While driving a Scottish cleric on a tour of her Balmoral estate, she suddenly shouted, "Hooray!" as they passed one of her gamekeepers walking on the hills with a young woman. The Queen explained that his wife had left him, and she was absolutely delighted that he was out with a new girlfriend. Sensitive? When Margaret Thatcher had her 80th birthday party in 2005, she had become frail, and her mind had been impaired by strokes. As the Queen approached, the former Prime Minister extended her hand, and the Queen held it as Margaret Thatcher curtsied to her. But what was surprising is that the Queen continued to hold her hand and then tenderly guided her through the crowd of 650 guests, which was a remarkable sight for the British, who are unaccustomed to seeing the Queen so physically demonstrative. Compassionate? When IRA terrorists killed Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Queen's cousin and Philip's favorite uncle, along with several other members of his family, the Queen cared for Mountbatten's 14-year-old grandson, Timothy Knatchbull, who had been severely injured in the attack. When he arrived at Balmoral late one evening with his sister, the Queen was there to greet them, and she served them soup and sandwiches, took them to their rooms, and even started to unpack them until she was prevailed upon to go to bed. Timothy later talked about her unstoppable mothering. He told me that the Queen had been caring and sensitive and intuitive, and that she had managed to get him talking about his traumatic experience in a way that nobody else had been able to do. Funny? British actress Prunella Scales got rave reviews for playing the Queen in Alan Bennett's play, A Question of Attribution. And when she was introduced to the Queen, she bowed, and the Queen said, "I expect you think I should be doing that to you." Earthy, probably the least expected trait. When you think of the prim and proper Queen, imagine her stalking stag on the hills above Balmoral in her Macintosh trousers, crawling on her stomach through the undergrowth with her nose up against the boots of the stalker in front of her. Or visiting her yearlings in their stables and seeing that they seemed to be suffering from respiratory problems. She blew her nose, showed her trainer what was in the handkerchief, and said, "It's too dusty in here. There's no air." Needless to say, he promptly installed a better ventilation system. And finally, something surprising, because I just think the image is so sweet. When the Queen and Prince Philip were guests of Ronald and Nancy Reagan on a trip to California in 1983, Reagan's Deputy Chief of Staff, Mike Deaver, asked the Queen's private secretary why she was taking so long to prepare for the evening. "The Queen needs her tiara time," he said. The private secretary explained that she has a little kit with tools that she uses to decorate certain diamond tiaras by hooking pearls or emeralds or sapphires or rubies on them, depending on what she's wearing. Her former crown jeweler, David Thomas, confirmed to me that this pastime is something she enjoys a great deal. While such private glimpses may surprise many people, Elizabeth's behavior as Queen has always been reassuring and consistent and predictable. Her wise conduct and her role as a unifying force are more valued today than ever. Long admired and respected, she is now beloved. When she celebrated her Golden Jubilee 10 years ago, people realized that she was about stability, continuity, calm through adversity, and humor when things are going wrong, her former senior advisor Charles Anson told me. Suddenly, they got the point of the Queen, who had been doing her job for 50 years. Now that she's reached her 60-year milestone, she is bigger than politics or celebrity or fashion. Yet she has learned to move with the times, making sure the monarchy is responsive without being trendy. Her ability to adapt to a changing world is all the more impressive when you consider that she grew up really in an Edwardian atmosphere. She is the sheet anchor in the middle for people to hang on to in times of turbulence, her lifelong friend and former top advisor, David Airlie, told me. She lives by the values we all wish to have, which have made her life story inspiring for me to write about, and I hope that readers are equally inspired.